My name is Clara. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as someone dependable. The kind of woman people trust with responsibility, with silence, with the unspoken tasks that keep everything running. I've been a wife, a professional, a caretaker of systems and emotions. And if you had asked the people around me to describe me back then, many of them would have said I was calm, reasonable, maybe even lucky. What they wouldn't have said is that I was strong, not because I wasn't, but because my strength didn't announce itself. I've never been loud. I don't escalate conflict. I don't feel pain. I learned early that staying composed made other people comfortable, and over time, that composure was mistaken for compliance, for passivity, for someone who would always be there, no matter what, was taken for granted. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal or a single explosive moment. It's not about revenge, exposure, or winning in the way movies teach us to win. There are no villains shouting in doorways, no last-minute rescues, no sudden twists of luck. What I'm going to tell you is quieter than that, and more honest. It's the story of how a marriage can slowly become a place where you disappear, not through cruelty that leaves bruises, but through small erasures that leave no visible mark. It's about what happens when being understanding becomes a habit, and that habit turns into a role you never agreed to play. Over the course of the story, you'll hear how I was seen, how I was reduced without anyone noticing, and how I learned to notice anyway. You'll hear about the moment something shifted inside me, not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. And you'll hear how leaving wasn't an act of anger or rebellion. It was an act of clarity. I'm not telling this to paint myself as a victim. And I'm certainly not telling it to paint anyone else as a monster. I believe most harm happens without conscious intent. People follow patterns that benefit them. Systems reward silence. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't malice. It's indifference wrapped in normalcy. This is a story about quiet dominance, but not the kind that seeks to overpower. It's about reclaiming authorship over your own life when no one expects you to. About choosing yourself without making a scene. About understanding that survival doesn't always look heroic from the outside, but it feels unmistakable on the inside. If you're listening to this because you're questioning something in your own life, something you can't quite name yet, I won't tell you what to do. I'll just tell you what I saw, what I learned, and what it cost me to stay versus what it gave me to leave. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever wondered whether the life you're holding together is slowly letting go of you? To them, I was reliable. That was the word people used most often, said with a small nod, as if it explained everything that needed explaining. Reliable Clara. The one who remembered birthdays without reminders. The one who handled logistics without fuss. The one who didn't need to be checked on because she always had it handled. In my marriage, that reliability translated into something even simpler. I was the steady background, the infrastructure, the quiet assurance that things would keep working. When my husband spoke about me to others, it was usually in summaries. She's great with details. She keeps everything organized. I don't know how she does it all. Those comments sounded like praise, and I accepted them as such at the time. I didn't notice how rarely they included anything about who I was, only what I provided. At dinners, I was the listener. At gatherings, the facilitator. I refilled glasses, smoothed transitions, noticed when conversations stalled, and gently revived them. I was good at making people feel comfortable, and because of that, I was rarely the focus. Comfort, I learned, doesn't draw attention. It dissolves into the environment. If I had an opinion that conflicted with the room, I expressed it carefully, softened it, added context so no one felt challenged. And when the conversation moved on, without engaging it, I told myself that was fine. Not every thought needs a response, I believed. Maturity means choosing your battles. Over time, that choice became automatic. In my professional life, it looked similar. I was trusted with responsibility but rarely spotlighted. I was the person called in when something was broken, not when something was celebrated. I didn't resent that. I took pride in being essential rather than visible. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing things would fall apart without you, even if no one says it out loud. At home, that same dynamic deepened. Decisions were often framed as joint, but the outcome was usually predetermined. If I hesitated, the pause was interpreted as agreement forming. If I raised concerns, they were met with reassurance rather than curiosity. You worry too much. It'll be fine, said kindly, dismissively. I wasn't ignored outright. That would have been easier to name. Instead, I was absorbed into the role of someone whose presence was assumed rather than engaged with. I was the constant in the equation, unchanging, dependable, and therefore unexamined. And here's the important part. I helped build that version of myself. I believed that love meant being low maintenance, that partnership meant reducing friction. If I could make life smoother for everyone, I was doing something noble. I told myself that wanting more attention, more acknowledgement, more space to be fully seen was unnecessary, indulgent even. So when people underestimated me, I didn't correct them. When my silence was mistaken for agreement, I let it stand. When my adaptability was interpreted as a lack of boundaries, I called it flexibility. There was no single moment when I thought, I am invisible. It was subtler than that. It was a series of moments where I noticed I could disappear from a room without anyone feeling the absence right away, where my emotional temperature didn't register unless it disrupted something. I was valued, yes, but like a foundation is valued. Essential but not admired. Trusted but not consulted. And still, I told myself I was lucky. Many people would want this life. Stability, predictability, being needed. What I didn't yet understand was the cost of being needed only for what you provide, never for who you are, or how dangerous it is when people grow accustomed to your presence without ever really seeing you. At that stage, I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't even unhappy in a way I could articulate. I was simply smaller than I used to be, quieter inside my own mind, more careful with my thoughts, as if they were fragile objects that might inconvenience someone if dropped. This is who I was to them, dependable, calm, undemanding, a woman who would always adjust. What I didn't realize yet was that being underestimated doesn't mean you are weak. Sometimes, it's just the cover you wear before you decide whether a place deserves the full weight of who you are. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was wrapped in normalcy. It arrived disguised as practicality, spoken in a tone that suggested efficiency rather than dismissal. If you had asked me that day whether anything was wrong, I would have said no without hesitation. We were standing in the kitchen, late afternoon light cutting across the counter. I remember the time because the house was quiet in that particular way it gets when the day hasn't quite ended, but everyone is already tired of it. I had been talking about something small, a decision we were supposed to make together. I don't even remember the subject now, which tells you how subtle the moment was. I do remember the interruption. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply spoke over me, finishing my sentence with a conclusion I hadn't reached. Then he moved on, already acting on that conclusion, as if my contribution had been a draft he was refining. It happened so smoothly that the conversation didn't pause. There was no silence to mark the shift, no awkwardness, just a seamless override. I remember stopping mid-thought, the rest of my sentence evaporating. Not because I was silenced, but because the space for my voice had quietly closed. I told myself it didn't matter. People interrupt each other all the time. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't intentional. I do the same thing sometimes, surely. The mind is very good at minimizing moments that threaten the story you believe about your life. But something lingered, not anger, confusion, a faint internal note that said, that didn't feel right. I ignored it. I always had. I went back to chopping vegetables, back to logistics, back to the role that felt familiar and safe. Later, when I mentioned the decision to someone else as though it had been mutual, the words tasted slightly off, not wrong enough to correct, just inaccurate enough to notice. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. No one else would have seen it. If they had been in the room, they might have laughed it off as efficient communication. And if I had tried to explain it, I would have struggled. How do you articulate the loss of something that was never acknowledged as yours to begin with? Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Not often, just enough to form a pattern if you were paying attention. A sentence is redirected, a preference rephrased as a suggestion, a concern answered with reassurance instead of engagement. You'll be fine. It's not a big deal. We don't need to overthink this. Each phrase was gentle, reasonable, even loving on the surface. And that's what made them dangerous. They didn't attack my perspective, they replaced it. I noticed that when I hesitated before speaking, the conversation moved on without me. That if I didn't assert myself quickly, the opportunity would pass. And because I disliked interrupting, disliked competing for space, I often let it pass. Again, I rationalized. This is what compromise looks like. Not everything has to be a discussion. I'm choosing peace. But peace shouldn't require erasure. The strangest part was how alone the experience felt. There was no obvious conflict to confide in, no incident to recount. If I had said, I feel dismissed, the response would have been confusion, maybe even hurt. Dismissed? That's not what I meant at all. And they would have been right. Intent matters, but impact accumulates. So I did what I'd always done. I adapted. I spoke more concisely. I edited myself in advance. I learned which topics were worth raising and which ones would only lead to that subtle closing of space. I became efficient with my own thoughts. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar immediately, but it marked the beginning of a quiet internal shift, from someone who assumed her voice belonged in the room to someone who checked first whether it would be useful. And once you start measuring your worth by usefulness, it becomes very easy for others to do the same, without ever realizing they're holding the knife. After the first few moments, it stopped registering as something unusual. That's the most unsettling part looking back. Not that the dismissals happened, but how quickly my mind adjusted to them. Humans are remarkably skilled at normalizing what they experience repeatedly, especially when it doesn't come with obvious cruelty attached. The interruptions became efficient conversations. The decisions made without me became already handled. The reassurance in place of dialogue became care. And I learned how to translate. When my input wasn't acknowledged, I told myself it meant he trusted my flexibility. When my preferences were overridden, I reframed it as him being decisive. When my concerns were smoothed over, I labeled it optimism. There's a certain pride in being the person who doesn't make things difficult. I noticed that when I pushed back, very gently, very reasonably, the room cooled. Not dramatically, just enough. A pause. A sigh. The faint sense that I was complicating something that didn't need complication. And because I was deeply invested in being seen as reasonable, I absorbed that message quickly. So I chose my words with more care. I prefaced my thoughts with disclaimers. I could be wrong, but it's probably not important, but maybe I'm overthinking this. Each phrase was a small apology for existing in the conversation, and still, I told myself this was adulthood. Those relationships mature into efficiency. That constant negotiation is exhausting. That harmony requires restraint. What I didn't realize then was that restraint was only being asked of one of us. At social gatherings, the dynamic became clearer, though I still didn't name it. He would recount shared stories, adjusting details for effect. Sometimes my role in them shrank. Sometimes my perspective disappeared entirely. I smiled along, correcting nothing. It felt petty to interrupt. The story landed fine without me. People laughed. Conversations flowed. No one noticed what had been edited out. On the drive home, I might mention it lightly. That's not exactly how it happened. And he would laugh, brushing it off. You're focusing on details. Or, it's the same thing. Same thing. Another translation. Over time, I began to anticipate what would be dismissed. I filtered myself automatically, offering only what fit smoothly into the existing narrative. I stopped bringing up topics that required time, nuance, or emotional attention. I learned the rhythm of conversations that worked and adjusted myself to match it. This wasn't done to me in a single direction. I participated. I collaborated. I told myself I was choosing peace, choosing love, choosing the bigger picture. But something inside me started to go quiet. Not sadness exactly, compression, as if parts of me were folding inward to take up less space. I still functioned, I still laughed, I still showed up. But I noticed that my inner world was becoming more private, less shared. Not because I wanted secrecy, but because there was no longer a place to put those thoughts where they would be held with care. The disrespect, if you can even call it that, was never loud enough to protest. It lived in tone, in pacing, in whose words is set the final direction. And because it wasn't overt, I kept questioning my own perception. Am I being too sensitive? Is this just how partnerships evolve? Do I really need to be heard on everything? These questions are powerful tools of self-erasure when repeated often enough. I noticed that when decisions went well, the credit was shared or assumed. When things went wrong, the responsibility quietly slid toward me. Not an accusation, just an expectation. I was the one who noticed things, after all, the one who handled details. If something fell through, it was framed as an oversight rather than a miscommunication. Again, no anger, just alignment, a role solidifying. I didn't feel mistreated. I felt managed, positioned, as if my value lay in my ability to support the structure, not question it. And the most convincing lie I told myself was that this was temporary. That if something truly important came up, I would speak. That I was choosing silence strategically. But silence chosen repeatedly stops being a choice. It becomes a habit. And habits shape identity. By the time I noticed how much I was editing myself, it already felt normal, familiar, safe. I had become fluent in minimizing my needs without feeling deprived, because I had stopped expecting anything else. This is how disrespect becomes invisible, not through escalation but through repetition, not by force but by normalization. And when something is normalized, challenging it feels disruptive, even when it's slowly erasing you. It wasn't given to me in words. No one sat me down and explained what was expected. Roles like this are rarely announced. They're revealed through repetition, through what is rewarded and what is quietly discouraged. I began to see it clearly when I imagined doing the opposite. What if I changed my mind suddenly? What if I said no without explaining? What if I needed time instead of offering solutions? The discomfort I felt just imagining those scenarios told me everything I needed to know. My role was to be reliable, useful, and invisible. Reliable meant I didn't waver. I didn't need reassurance. I didn't need a follow-up. I handled things. I absorbed stress. I kept the emotional climate stable. Useful meant my value showed up in outcomes. Clean logistics, smooth transitions, problems solved before they were noticed. I was appreciated most when my work eliminated the need for discussion. Invisible meant my inner experience didn't require accommodation. My silence was taken as consent. My adaptability was assumed. My absence from conversations, from decisions, from recognition, didn't register as a loss. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. In conversations, I was consulted late, after momentum had already formed. My input became a formality, not a shaping force. If I agreed, it confirmed the plan. If I hesitated, it was framed as unnecessary friction. At home, I noticed how often I adjusted without being asked. I preemptively smoothed things over. I caught issues early and resolved them quietly. And because these actions prevented conflict, they were invisible by design. No one thanked the fire alarm for staying silent. What unsettled me most wasn't how others treated me. It was how naturally I stepped into the role. I had been trained for it long before this marriage. Good girls don't take up space. Competent women don't need attention. Love is proven through sacrifice. So when I felt a twinge of resentment, I corrected myself. This is a partnership. When I felt lonely, I dismissed it. Everyone gets busy. When I felt unseen, I reframed it. Not everything needs to be about me. But roles have consequences. The more I fulfilled mine, the more it solidified. Expectations calcified around my consistency. Any deviation felt like a malfunction rather than a boundary. When I was tired, it was surprising. When I was uncertain, it was inconvenient. I realized that my emotional range had narrowed in the eyes of others. I was allowed to be calm, supportive, and efficient. Anything else felt out of character, disruptive to the system I had helped maintain. And yet, there was comfort in the role, predictability, safety. I knew how to succeed at being this version of myself. I knew how to earn approval without asking for anything in return. The danger wasn't that the role existed. Every relationship has dynamics. The danger was that I had no exit strategy, no language for renegotiation, no precedent for being met with curiosity instead of correction. I began to notice how often I was described in functional terms. She handles that. She's good with that. Rarely, she feels, or she wants. It was as if my interior life had become optional. I didn't blame anyone for this, not fully. Roles persist because they work. They reduce uncertainty. They keep systems efficient. And I had been very effective in mine. But effectiveness isn't the same as fulfillment. There was a moment, small, unremarkable, when I caught my reflection in a darkened window late at night. I looked composed, capable, fine. And I remember thinking, if I disappeared emotionally, how long would it take anyone to notice? That thought scared me, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I already knew the answer. This was the role I had been assigned, and more importantly, the role I had accepted. What I didn't yet know was that roles only have power as long as you keep playing them. And the moment you stop, even quietly, the entire structure begins to wobble. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a raised voice or a slammed door. The day something shifted looked, from the outside, exactly like every other day. That's why it took me so long to recognize its importance. It was a weekday morning, overcast. the kind of gray that presses gently against the windows without asking permission. I was sitting at the small table by the window with my notebook open, not writing anything meaningful, just making lists, tasks, reminders, the quiet maintenance of a life. I remember pausing mid-list, pen hovering, because a thought surfaced that didn't belong to the task at hand. If nothing changes, this will be the rest of my life. The thought wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with panic or despair. It was factual, almost calm. And that's what made it impossible to ignore. I didn't feel angry at my husband. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt something closer to grief, but not for what had happened, for what wasn't going to happen if I stayed exactly as I was. I looked around the room and noticed how everything functioned smoothly. The systems I had built were working. The routines were efficient. The house reflected order and predictability. And suddenly, instead of feeling proud, I felt strangely absent. It occurred to me that I could continue like this indefinitely, that nothing external would force a change. There would be no crisis dramatic enough to justify leaving, no clear wrongdoing that could be explained easily to others. If I wanted something different, I would have to choose it without permission. That realization landed quietly, but it landed deep. For the first time, I didn't ask myself what would be easiest, or most reasonable, or least disruptive. I asked a different question. What am I sacrificing to keep this stable? The answer wasn't immediate. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back. I saw how often I anticipated needs before they were expressed, how rarely my own needs entered the equation at all, how my silence had become structural, holding everything together while hollowing me out. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't announce a boundary or demand a conversation. Instead, I did something much smaller and much more dangerous to the status quo. I stopped translating my discomfort into excuses. When something felt off, I let it feel off. I didn't rush to reframe it as a misunderstanding or oversensitivity. I let the sensation exist without resolving it. That was new. Later that evening, there was a familiar moment, one where a decision was being made quickly, momentum carrying it forward. Normally, I would have nodded, adapted, and filled in the gaps. This time, I said nothing. Not in protest, not in strategy. I simply didn't offer the smoothing response that usually came automatically. I watched what happened when I didn't intervene. The conversation moved on, the decision stood, and something inside me clicked. They don't need my agreement, they need my compliance. That distinction mattered. It wasn't about being heard. It was about being required. And I realized that my presence had become optional emotionally, but essential functionally. I was part of the machinery, not the direction. That night, lying awake, I felt an unfamiliar clarity. Not urgency, not fear, clarity. The kind that doesn't demand immediate action, but makes inaction impossible to justify. I understood then that if I stayed, nothing would change. Not because anyone was malicious, but because the system worked too well. It rewarded my silence. It relied on my flexibility. It had no incentive to evolve. And I understood something else too. Leaving didn't have to be loud to be final. The shift wasn't about confrontation. It was about authorship. About deciding that my internal life mattered enough to protect, even if no one else noticed its absence yet. That day marked the end of my waiting. Not waiting for someone to change. Not waiting for permission. Not waiting for a reason dramatic enough to be understood by others. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. And in that grounding, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop disappearing for the sake of stability. Whatever came next, I would meet it without shrinking. That was the day something shifted. Not in the room, not in the relationship. In me. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still spoke when spoken to. I still handled what needed handling. I still smiled at the right moments and kept the machinery running. If anyone had been observing closely, they might have said I seemed calmer, less reactive, easier even. What they couldn't see was that my silence was no longer automatic. Before, it had been a reflex, an instinct to smooth, to soften, to preempt discomfort. Now it was deliberate, measured. I began to notice the split second before I would usually step in, and in that space, I made a decision. Sometimes I spoke, often I didn't, not out of spite, not to teach anyone a lesson, but because I wanted to see what happened when I didn't carry the emotional weights of every moment, when I didn't translate, clarify, or cushion the edges of other people's choices. The results were revealing. Conversations became shorter, decisions became faster, but also less thoughtful. Small issues surfaced that I had previously absorbed without comment. Things were forgotten, timelines slipped. Not catastrophically, just enough to be noticeable. And each time, there was a flicker of surprise. Not directed at the situation, but at me. You didn't remind me. I thought you were handling that. You usually catch these things. Usually. That word followed me everywhere. It was spoken casually, without accusation, but it carried an assumption that my role was fixed, that my silence meant I was still holding the threads together behind the scenes. I didn't correct them. This was the part that required the most restraint. Not stepping in to reassert control, not proving my competence, letting the gap remain visible. Silence, I learned, is deeply uncomfortable for people who are used to being supported by it. They mistook my quiet for agreement, for indifference, for exhaustion, for weakness, anything but what it actually was, a recalibration. I noticed how quickly concern turned into irritation when the usual support didn't arrive. How often the question wasn't, "Are you okay?" but "Why didn't you?" The absence of my intervention was felt, but my interior life was still not consulted. That told me everything I needed to know. There was a moment, a small one, when a minor problem escalated because I didn't step in early. Nothing dramatic, just enough inconvenience to ripple outward. I watched the reaction carefully. No one asked why I had stepped back. They assumed oversight, a lapse, a temporary deviation from the role, and that assumption freed me. If my silence could be misread so easily, then my presence had never been fully understood to begin with. I started keeping notes, not about people, but about patterns. What happened when I stayed quiet? Who filled the space? Who didn't notice it at all? Which systems depended on my invisible labor to function smoothly? This wasn't preparation yet, it was an observation. Emotionally, something shifted as well. Without the constant pressure to manage outcomes, I felt lighter, less entangled. My thoughts stretched out again, uncompressed. I began to hear myself more clearly. Not what I should want, but what I actually felt. And what I felt wasn't rage or bitterness. It was resolved. Silence, when chosen, has a different weight. It creates space, not just in conversations, but in identity. It allows you to step back far enough to see the structure you're standing inside. Others continued as before, unaware that the foundation had subtly shifted. They interpreted my calm as compliance, my distance as fatigue. They didn't see the internal line I had crossed, the one that separated participation from observation. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was trying to understand. And in that understanding, I realized something critical. When people underestimate you, they stop monitoring you closely. They assume consistency. They rely on patterns. That assumption creates opportunity. I wasn't acting yet. I wasn't planning an exit. I was simply no longer filling in the gaps automatically. And in those gaps, the truth of the dynamic became visible. Silence had stopped being something done to me. It had become something I used. What they never noticed wasn't a secret meeting or a hidden plan. It wasn't a sudden change in behavior dramatic enough to raise alarms. What they missed was much quieter than that. They never noticed that I started watching instead of managing. When you stop rushing to fix things, you see how they actually break. When you stop explaining yourself, you hear what others assume. When you stop cushioning outcomes, patterns reveal themselves without distortion. I began to notice how information flowed, or didn't. Who was informed early? Who was looped in late? Whose preferences shaped decisions by default? It wasn't personal in the way people imagine manipulation to be. It was structural, habitual, efficient for some, costly for others. I noticed how often my name appeared on documents tied to responsibility, and how rarely it appeared next to authority. How I was expected to know details without being present for decisions. How access and accountability were quietly separated. I also noticed something more uncomfortable, how much I already knew. Because I had been invisible for so long, I had become observant by necessity. I knew the rhythms of finances, the patterns of spending, the assumptions embedded in long-term plans. I understood which systems depended on my quiet labor and which ones pretended they didn't. None of this was new information. What was new was that I stopped treating it as background noise. I began documenting, not in a way that felt dramatic or paranoid, but methodical. Dates, conversations, decisions were made without consultation that later required my involvement to execute. I wasn't collecting evidence against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. Clarity is a form of leverage when you've been underestimated. I educated myself in small, unremarkable ways. Reading policies, understanding legal frameworks that had always felt abstract before, learning how shared responsibilities are actually defined, not how they're assumed to work, but how they function on paper. This wasn't about preparing for a fight. It was about no longer being dependent on interpretations that benefited someone else. What surprised me was how easy this phase was to hide. No one questioned my quiet research. No one asked why I was reading more, asking fewer questions. My competence had always been trusted, just not my autonomy. As long as I didn't disrupt routines, my inner shifts went unnoticed. That's the paradox of being underestimated. You're watched less closely. I noticed how often I had been shielding others from consequences. Social, logistical, emotional. I had framed it as kindness, as a partnership. But now I saw it differently. I had been absorbing impact so others wouldn't have to adapt. So I stopped, not abruptly, gradually. I allowed natural consequences to land where they belonged. I didn't announce it, I simply stepped out of the way. And still, no one noticed the pattern forming. What they saw was continuity. What they assumed was stability. They didn't realize that the very traits they relied on, my patience, my attention to detail, my emotional regulation, were now being directed inward instead of outward. I also noticed something else, how little curiosity there was about my interior life. No one asked what I was thinking. No one wondered why I seemed more distant. The absence of inquiry told me that my role had never included being known, only being useful. That realization didn't hurt the way it would have earlier. It clarified. I wasn't withdrawing to punish anyone. I was reallocating energy. The care I had poured into maintaining the system was being redirected into understanding my options within it. This is the phase people romanticize incorrectly. They imagine secret strength as plotting, as dramatic preparation. In reality, it's mostly reading, observing, and choosing not to react. It's learning the difference between loyalty and self-abandonment. It's realizing that you don't need to announce a shift for it to be real. By the time anything outward changed, the decision would already be made internally. That's the advantage of quiet work. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't require acknowledgement. And because no one saw me as someone who would leave, because I had been so consistent, so adaptable, so reasonable, they never questioned my permanence. They assumed I would always be there to adjust. They never noticed that I had stopped adjusting myself and started adjusting my future instead. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I sat back and thought, I've got it. That's not how clarity works when it's earned slowly. It arrived as confirmation. By this point, I had been observing for months, quietly, consistently. I understood the systems we lived inside far better than I ever had when I was actively maintaining them. And one evening, while reviewing something I had seen dozens of times before, I noticed what I had previously overlooked. Not because it was hidden, but because I had never needed to look at it from this angle. It was a structural imbalance, subtle, legal, unremarkable on the surface. The kind of thing people assume is fair because it's common. Shared responsibilities that weren't actually shared. Commitments that relied on my consistency without formally acknowledging my agency. I realized then that the life we had built depended far more on my participation than I had been led to believe. Not emotionally, structurally. And with that realization came something unexpected, calm. There was no triumph in it. No sense of victory. Just a steady understanding that I was not as trapped as I had once assumed. This wasn't leverage in the dramatic sense. It wasn't something to wield or threaten. It was knowledge, precise, contextual, grounded in reality rather than hope. I saw clearly what would happen if I stayed. What would be required of me to maintain the status quo. And I saw what would happen if I didn't. For the first time, the choice wasn't abstract. I didn't share this discovery with anyone, not out of secrecy, but because it wasn't something that needed discussion. It was mine. A private recalibration of power, not over another person, but over my own future. I sat with it for days, letting the implications settle, letting myself feel the weight of it without rushing toward action. I needed to be certain that what I was seeing wasn't colored by emotion or fatigue. It wasn't. If anything, the absence of drama confirmed it. This wasn't about being right. It was about being honest. I noticed how differently I moved through the world after that. Not outwardly, my routine stayed the same. But internally, I was no longer bracing myself. I wasn't waiting for permission or validation. I wasn't scanning conversations for signs of change. I already knew what I needed to know. What struck me most was how little this revelation altered my feelings toward my husband. There was no surge of anger, no desire to confront or expose. The clarity didn't make him smaller, it made the situation clearer. I understood that this imbalance hadn't been created overnight. It was the result of years of quiet accommodation, of my willingness to be flexible, of his comfort with that flexibility. Blame felt irrelevant. What mattered was alignment. Could I remain in a structure that required my self-erasure to function smoothly? Could I continue to invest in something that depended on me being smaller than I was? The answer didn't come as a declaration. It came as a simple, steady no. That no didn't need to be spoken yet. It lived in my posture, in the way I stopped justifying my fatigue, in the way I no longer rushed to fill the silence, in the way my thoughts began to extend beyond the present arrangement without guilt. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a weakness in someone else. It was about discovering my own margin. I realized that I had options, not because someone would grant them to me, but because they already existed. I had simply never claimed them. And once you see your options clearly, you can't unsee them. You can delay action, you can gather yourself, but you can't return to the illusion that staying is the only reasonable choice. There was no celebration, no relief, just resolve. I went to sleep that night knowing something fundamental had shifted, not in the relationship but in my orientation to it. I was no longer deciding whether to endure. I was deciding when and how to step away intact. Once you see the exit clearly, the hardest part isn't leaving. It's deciding how to leave without betraying yourself in the process. For a long time, I had believed there were only two options: stay and endure quietly, or leave in a way that would fracture everything emotionally, socially, financially. That binary kept me frozen. It framed departure as destruction and endurance as virtue. The private clarity I had gained dismantled that framing. I began to list my options, not as fantasies, but as realistic paths with consequences. I wrote them down in my notebook, the same way I had once written grocery lists. Calmly, precisely, without dramatization. Option 1, stay as I was, continue absorbing, translating, and smoothing. Maintain stability at the cost of my interior life. This option was familiar, predictable, and now clearly unsustainable. Option 2, attempt renegotiation, name what I had been carrying, ask for a structural change. Risk is minimized, misunderstood, or temporarily appeased. Hope that awareness would lead to transformation. I examined this option carefully, not cynically, honestly. Renegotiation requires mutual curiosity. It requires a willingness to question comfort. And it requires time during which I would have to stay exposed, uncertain, and still responsible for holding things together. I asked myself a difficult question. Had there ever been evidence that my discomfort, when expressed softly, led to meaningful change? The answer was consistent silence, reframed as reassurance. Option 3, leave decisively, but quietly, without spectacle, without demands for understanding, without waiting for permission to prioritize myself. This option carried risk. Emotional fallout, misinterpretation. The certainty that some people would never fully understand why I left, because they had never seen what I was carrying. But it also carried integrity. The more I sat with it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about choosing the least painful option. Pain was unavoidable. It was about choosing the pain that didn't require me to keep abandoning myself. There is a particular clarity that arrives when you realize you've already grieved the relationship you're in, not the person, but the version of connection you hoped would emerge if you just tried harder, stayed quieter, gave more. I had grieved that future already, quietly, privately, over months of observation and recalibration. What remained was the present and my responsibility to it. The decision point wasn't marked by urgency. It was marked by stillness, a sense that the internal debate had ended, that I was no longer weighing possibilities, but planning execution. And that planning didn't involve confrontation. I didn't want to argue my way out. I didn't want to justify my departure with a list of grievances. I didn't want to force recognition from someone who had benefited from not seeing me clearly. I wanted to leave whole. That meant choosing an irreversible path. Not because it was dramatic, but because it protected me from being talked back into erasure. I knew myself well enough to know that if I left room for endless discussion, I would end up managing someone else's emotions again, at the expense of my own clarity. So I made the decision privately, fully, and without conditions. I didn't announce it. I didn't test it. I didn't ask for feedback. I aligned my actions with it. From that moment on, everything I did served one purpose: a clean, dignified exit that didn't require anyone else's agreement to be valid. The strangest part was how calm I felt. No rush of freedom, no fear spiral, just a grounded sense of direction. When a decision is right, it doesn't need adrenaline to sustain it. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something, myself, intact. That was the decision point. Not a dramatic crossroads, but a quiet internal line crossed with full awareness. Once crossed, there was no going back. Once the decision was made, my life split into two timelines. There was the visible one, the routines, conversations, shared spaces that looked unchanged to everyone else. And then there was the invisible one, where each small action pointed quietly toward an ending no one else had been invited to imagine yet. I didn't rush. Moving in silence isn't about speed, it's about alignment. I began with practicalities, not emotions. I had learned by then that emotions fluctuate, but structures hold. I reviewed finances the way I always had, but this time I read them as someone who would soon need clarity, not continuity. I made copies of documents that were ours, simply because I was allowed to. I familiarized myself with processes I had previously trusted others to handle. Nothing illegal, nothing deceptive, just prepared. I adjusted timelines in my head. What needed to be resolved before anything was said. What could wait. What absolutely couldn't be left ambiguous. I learned which decisions had momentum and which depended quietly on my participation, and I began to withdraw that participation selectively, not in ways that would raise suspicion, just enough to ensure that when I stepped away fully, nothing essential would collapse onto me out of habit. I stopped being the default problem solver. I let questions linger instead of answering them immediately. I allowed responsibility to land where it naturally belonged. Still, no one noticed. That's the thing about invisibility. It's hard to detect when it's no longer volunteering itself. I kept my tone neutral. My demeanor is steady. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. I focused on precision, on timing, on making sure that when the moment came, I wouldn't need to negotiate under pressure. There was grief during this phase, but it was contained. It surfaced in quiet moments, folding laundry, washing dishes, standing in line somewhere ordinary. Not grief for the decision, but for the simplicity that would be lost, the shared shorthand, the history, the comfort of familiarity. Even when that familiarity had become constraining, I let myself feel that without letting it redirect me. At the same time, I noticed something unexpected. My body felt calmer, my sleep deepened. The low-grade tension I had carried for years, always anticipating, always smoothing, began to loosen. My nervous system, it seemed, recognized safety before my circumstances changed. I didn't confide in friends. Not yet. I didn't want reassurance or doubt. I wanted clarity to remain undiluted. Silence at this stage protected the integrity of my decision. And because I wasn't performing distress, nothing triggered concern. I was calm after all, reasonable, the same as always. That familiarity worked in my favor. When logistical steps required explanation, I offered simple ones, plausible, true but incomplete. I wasn't lying, I was choosing relevance. Not everyone is entitled to the full narrative while you're still inside it. I watched how easily routines continued without my emotional investment, how systems adapted, imperfectly, when I didn't intervene. It confirmed what I already knew. My presence had been stabilizing, but not irreplaceable. And that realization, instead of wounding me, strengthened my resolve. I wasn't indispensable because of who I was. I had been indispensable because I made myself so, and I was allowed to stop. By the time the visible timeline caught up with the invisible one, everything essential was already in place. I wasn't stepping into the unknown. I was stepping into a future I had quietly prepared for, piece by piece. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about respect, for myself, for the gravity of the decision, and for the understanding that not every ending needs an audience while it's being built. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small, almost comical ways. Missed details, overlooked steps, questions that circled back to me after I had already stepped aside. People noticed things weren't as smooth, but they couldn't identify why. Something felt off, just not off enough to name. I watched this carefully, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet detachment. When you've spent years absorbing friction, its absence becomes noticeable to others long before it becomes alarming. The first real sign was frustration, not directed at me directly, at least not yet, but at the situation. Plans took longer, decisions required follow-up. Tasks that had once moved invisibly from thought to execution now stalled in the middle, waiting for someone to bridge the gap. I was no longer that bridge, and because no one had consciously acknowledged how much I had been carrying, The loss was felt as an inconvenience rather than an absence, like a tool that used to be there and suddenly wasn't, without anyone remembering who put it there in the first place. I was asked questions I had answered dozens of times before. Where do we keep? Didn't you usually? Can you just? Each time I responded calmly, briefly. Sometimes I redirected. Sometimes I didn't respond at all, not out of spite, but because it genuinely wasn't mine to handle anymore. That's when the emotional consequences began. I sensed irritation underneath the confusion. A subtle edge, not anger exactly, disorientation. People don't like it when systems stop working and they can't locate the cause. And because I wasn't making a scene, I wasn't offering an explanation, I became a blank surface for projection. Maybe I was distracted, maybe I was tired, maybe I was being distant. None of these interpretations was threatening enough to prompt reflection. Yet, what I noticed most was not how others reacted, but how I didn't. In the past, even mild tension would have pulled me into repair mode. I would have explained, reassured, and filled in the gaps before discomfort had time to solidify. Now I let it sit, not because I wanted anyone to suffer, but because I refused to rescue the system from the consequences of my absence. Doing so would have meant resuming the role I had already outgrown. There was a particular moment that stands out. A decision had been made without my involvement, quickly, confidently. Weeks later, complications surfaced, the kind I used to anticipate early and quietly resolve. This time, they landed fully. I was informed, not consulted, asked to help, not to decide. I listened, I nodded, and I said calmly that I didn't have the capacity to take that on. The silence that followed was heavy, not with anger, but with surprise. Capacity had never been a variable before. That word, capacity, changed the dynamic more than any accusation could have. It introduced a limit where there had previously been none. After that, things shifted more noticeably. Conversations became strained. There was an unspoken sense that something was wrong, but no one wanted to ask the question that might destabilize everything further. Loss, when it arrives gradually, often goes unnamed. People began to feel the absence of ease, of emotional buffering, of someone making the path smoother without being asked. And because they didn't know how to articulate that loss, it showed up as impatience, as restlessness, as a vague dissatisfaction with how things were unfolding. Still, no one asked me what had changed. They felt the impact without tracing it back to the source. And in that space, between consequence and understanding, I remained steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just present in a new way, limited, self-defined. That steadiness unsettled the dynamic more than any emotional outburst could have. Because when you don't react the way people expect, when you don't rush to repair what breaks in your absence, you force others to confront a reality they've never examined, that what they relied on was never guaranteed. The consequences had begun, quietly, inevitably, and there was no way to roll them back without me stepping back into a role I had already left behind. By the time the urgency appeared, the window had already closed. That's the cruel irony of quiet endings. When people finally sense the loss, they assume it's a signal to intervene, without realizing the decision has already been lived with, internally, for a long time. The first attempts to fix things were subtle, a little more attention, a few questions that sounded like curiosity but felt more like troubleshooting. Are you okay lately? You seem quieter than usual. Is something stressing you out? They weren't bad questions. In another timeline, they might have mattered. But they came too late, and from the wrong place. They weren't rooted in a desire to understand me. They were responses to friction, to the discomfort of a system no longer functioning as smoothly as before. I answered honestly but minimally. Yes, I was fine. Yes, work was busy. No, nothing specific was wrong, because by then, nothing specific was wrong. What had been wrong was cumulative, structural, years in the making. As the consequences continued, concern sharpened into something closer to panic. Not loud panic, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. I could feel the anxiety behind conversations, the recalibration attempts, the sudden willingness to discuss things that had once been brushed aside. There were offers to talk things through, suggestions of compromise, small gestures that would have meant the world to me years earlier. But timing matters. Repair requires more than intention. It requires acknowledgement of what was lost and why. And that acknowledgement never quite arrived. What I heard instead was a focus on outcomes. Things don't feel the same. We've been disconnected. I don't understand why you're pulling away. As if I hadn't been standing still while everything else moved past me. I realized then that the version of me they were trying to retrieve was the functional one, the one who smoothed, translated, absorbed. The calm presence that made life easier without asking for anything in return. That version wasn't coming back. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because she no longer existed. There was a moment when I was asked directly what I needed. It should have felt validating. It didn't. Because the question came from urgency, not curiosity. From fear of loss, not understanding of harm. And I knew that whatever answer I gave would be filtered through the same system that had minimized me before. Negotiated, reframed, reduced to something manageable. I didn't want to be managed anymore. I said I needed space, time. And that answer was met with resistance, not overt, but emotional. Appeals to history, to invest. How much had already been built together? All true, all insufficient. You can't build a future on a foundation that requires one person to disappear to hold it up. By this point, the attempts to fix things felt like trying to stabilize a building after the supports had been quietly removed. Temporary measures, cosmetic adjustments. Nothing addressed the fundamental imbalance. I wasn't angry, I wasn't cold. I was done. The hardest part was recognizing that even now, at the moment of crisis, my inner life was still not the focus. The question wasn't what has she been carrying? It was how do we get things back to normal? Normal had been the problem. When I finally said that I didn't believe things could be fixed, not in the way they were hoping, the reaction was disbelief. Not rage, not cruelty, just genuine shock. Because people who benefit from stability often mistake it for permanence. They assume that if something has endured quietly, it always will. What they don't see is the quiet work of someone preparing to leave without breaking themselves in the process. By the time the urgency arrived, I had already made peace with the ending. I had already mourned what wasn't going to be possible. I wasn't waiting to be convinced. Fixing it would have required me to become smaller again, to reassure, to compromise my clarity, to re-enter negotiations that had always ended in my erasure. That was no longer an option. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cruel, it was simply too late. The conversation people imagine as a confrontation rarely looks the way it does in real life. There was no shouting, no accusations hurled across a room, no dramatic ultimatum delivered with trembling hands. When it finally happened, it was almost understated, so calm it seemed at first, unremarkable. We sat across from each other in a familiar space, a place that had held countless ordinary conversations. And that familiarity stripped the moment of spectacle. There was nothing performative left to hide behind. I spoke first, not because I was angry, but because I was clear. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old moments or explain how long I had felt unseen. I didn't need to prove my pain in order for my decision to be valid. I said simply that I was leaving, not thinking about leaving, not needing space. Leaving. The words landed softly. And because they weren't accompanied by emotion, they landed harder. I could see the mind scrambling for context, for explanation, for something to push against. But there was nothing sharp in my tone, nothing to argue with. That's what made it unsettling. Questions followed, measured at first, then more urgent. How long had I felt this way? Why hadn't I said something sooner? Was there someone else? Was this about a specific incident? I answered honestly but briefly. There was no single moment. I had tried, in the ways I knew how. No, there was no one else. Yes, I was sure. Each answer closed a door gently but firmly. At one point, I was asked why I wasn't more upset. Why did I seem so calm about something that should have been devastating? I remember pausing before answering, not to soften the truth, but to choose the right one. I already did my grieving, I said. I just didn't do it out loud. That was the closest I came to explaining the years behind the decision. The conversation never turned cruel. It didn't need to. There was sadness, confusion, regret, expressed in fragments. But there was also something else, an awareness finally, that what was being lost wasn't sudden. It had been happening quietly for a long time. I didn't defend myself when my calm was interpreted as detachment. I didn't argue when my certainty was mistaken for coldness. I knew how easily composure can be misunderstood when people expect emotional collapse. But composure wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the result of alignment. I wasn't trying to be understood in that moment. I was trying to be honest without cruelty, to leave without rewriting history or assigning blame that wouldn't lead anywhere meaningful. The confrontation, if you can call it that, ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There was no agreement, no shared understanding reached neatly at the end. And that was okay. Not every ending needs consensus. Some just need the truth. When I stood up to leave that conversation, I felt steady, not relieved, not triumphant, steady. as if I had finally stopped leaning against something that was no longer holding me. There was no turning back after that. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Calmly, clearly, without heat. That calm wasn't indifference. It was respect for myself, and for the reality that had been too quiet to hear, until I stopped drowning it out with accommodation. After leaving, there was a strange quiet. Not the tense silence of something unfinished, but the open quiet of a room after furniture has been moved out. Empty, yes, but honest. Who I am now isn't defined by contrast to who I was then. There was no reinvention, no dramatic transformation. I didn't become louder or sharper or more visibly powerful. I didn't adopt a new identity to prove that leaving had been worth it. What changed was simpler and deeper. I no longer organize my life around being easy to live with. That doesn't mean I'm difficult. It means I don't preemptively reduce myself to preserve comfort that isn't mutual. I don't manage other people's emotions at the cost of my own clarity. I don't translate my needs into palatable versions so they'll be accepted without friction. I've learned that peace maintained through self-erasure isn't peace. It's a postponement. Today, my days are quieter in a different way. Not compressed, but spacious. I notice my own thoughts again without rushing to categorize them as reasonable or inconvenient. I allow pauses in conversation. I don't fill them reflexively. I let people show me how they handle space without my intervention. Some relationships didn't survive that shift. Others deepened. What surprised me most was how neutral that outcome felt. There was no bitterness attached to what fell away, just information, clarity about what was required my disappearance to function, and what didn't. I am still calm, still observant, still measured. But now those traits serve me, not the system around me. I make decisions without rehearsing how they'll be received. I speak when something matters to me, even if my voice shakes slightly from disuse. And when I don't speak, it's because I've chosen not to, not because I've been edited out. There are moments when the old reflex returns. When I feel the urge to smooth, to absorb, to make myself smaller for efficiency's sake. I notice it now. That noticing is everything. I don't punish myself for it. I simply ask a different question. Is this alignment or habit? That question has become my compass. I don't tell the story as a warning or a blueprint. I don't believe there's a single right way to leave or to stay. What I know is this. The version of me who left did so without hatred, without spectacle, and without needing to be validated by anyone else's understanding. That matters to me, because survival doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like finally standing still long enough to feel the ground under your feet and choosing not to sink into it anymore. I didn't lose my marriage. I escaped a version of myself that was disappearing inside it, and in doing so, I didn't gain freedom as a concept. I gained myself as a presence, solid, imperfect, and no longer optional in my own life. There's a story people like to tell about endings like this. It usually goes something like, she finally stood up for herself, or she found her voice, or she chose freedom over fear. Those stories aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. Because what actually happened wasn't a sudden awakening or a dramatic act of courage. It was a slow, quiet accumulation of honesty, an unwillingness to keep paying a price that no one had ever explicitly asked me to pay, but everyone had grown comfortable with me covering. The moral of the story isn't that leaving is always the answer. It's that staying should never require your disappearance. I didn't leave because I was mistreated in a way that would satisfy an audience. I left because I had become structurally unnecessary as a person and structurally essential as a function. And that imbalance, left unexamined, will hollow anyone out over time. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about recognizing when your silence is no longer peace, it's permission. Permission for others to keep benefiting from your restraint. Permission for systems to remain unchanged. Permission for your inner life to stay unvisited. Walking away wasn't failure, it was a refusal. Refusal to keep negotiating my worth. Refusal to keep translating my needs into acceptable language. Refusal to wait for a moment was dramatic enough to justify what I already knew. There was no winner in this story, no villain unmasked, no revenge served cold or hot. There was just a woman who noticed, early enough, to leave with her integrity intact. If you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't need to be pushed to the edge to justify choosing yourself. You don't need to collect evidence dramatic enough for public approval. You don't need permission to step out of a role that only exists because you keep playing it. And you don't need to explain your survival to people who never noticed you were disappearing. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave quietly, before resentment teaches you to be someone you're not. Before love turns into endurance, before calm turns into numbness, before your silence becomes the most valuable thing you offer. If this story resonated with you, it might not be because our lives look the same. It might be because you recognize the feeling of being essential but unseen, of being relied on but not truly known. So I'll end the way I began, without instructions, without conclusions, just with a question meant to sit with you for a while. In your own life, is your silence a choice, or a habit you've been praised for so long that no one notices what it's costing you? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.